colleagues. So tonight we have the honor and the pleasure to welcome for the CGSS public lecture Professor Gilles Delannoy, who is a professor at the Sciences Po Paris, an elite institution in France and worldwide. Professor Delannoy has published extensively on many issues pertaining to government studies, hence we are here, and especially on issues related to the nation, nationalism, and political history at large. We have here a selection of his books, and this is one of the rare books that he published in 1991 and which was reedited some time ago on the theories of nationalism. So tonight, Professor Delannoy is going to take us on an intellectual journey and try to discuss with us the meaning of the nation, what does the nation mean, and also pertaining to nationalism. So, and we think in the CGSS that this is a very much relevant topic since we live in a country that is having a nation for the Chinese, but at the same time several political forms, at least two of them, and we happen to live in the second political form, that is the Macau Special Administrative Region. So without further ado, let us welcome Professor Delannoy for his 30-minute presentation.
It's a great pleasure for me to be with you tonight, and I'll try to explain one very simple idea, but the distinction between nation as a political form and nation as a cultural form. It's a relevant question, since nation nowadays is the most typical, as well as the most ordinary form of existence for independent countries. The United Nations bears in its name nations instead of states, for example, a word that would have been more appropriate, or instead of countries of people, which were also available when the organization's name was coined. By the way, United was even less appropriate. Forum of corporations are closer to the realities. I've devised three parts for this lecture. The first part deals with the nature and variety of political regimes, a short one. The second deals with the nature and variety of political forms. And at this point I shall connect regimes and forms. This timetable will also give me the opportunity to explain my theory of nationalism. 2,400 years ago, Aristotle built the first important typology of political regimes. Aristotle's distinction was primarily based on the number of holders of the supreme political office. Monarchy, as you know, is the rule of one person, a monarch, a king, or an emperor. Aristocracy is the rule of a few, when they are a legitimate elite, the best. Democracy is the rule of all the members of the body politic. In the ancient time, everyone was equal, provided he belonged to the body politic, but the basis was narrow. Democracy did not include slaves, residents, and women. In fact, Aristotle's presentation is a bit more complicated. There is a good and a bad type for every regime. That is to say, a correct and a degenerated constitution for every regime. That's not very important for us tonight, so I will skip this part. Ancient democracy, as I used to say, was strong but narrow. Things have changed. Modern democracy applies to all the people and not only to the citizens of a curtailed body politic. This broader definition is compensated by the fact that democracy has become more indirect than direct, more representative than participative. Today's liberal democracy at its best stands somewhere in between the aristocratic and the republican models described by Aristotle. Many scholars have advocated the mixed constitution in which the three types of government, By one, the few and the many are embodied in equal proportion. This is the end of my very short first part, but I will use several of its elements hereafter. Let's consider now political forms in general. In human history, the number of political forms amounts to 3 or a maximum of 4. The tribe, the empire, the city or city-state, the nation. These are distinguishable forms. I suggest to leave out the tribe. The tribe is a real but incomplete political form, an undeveloped body politic, even if it might prove resilient in many cases. The basic form, the 3 basic forms, may often overlap. Political realities are more complex than typologies. These are not isolated forms, but forms distinguishable by comparison. Let's look over famous types of empire. The Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Ottoman Empire. An empire almost always carries a self-assumption of centrality. 中国. By way of example, these are famous cities or city-states. Ancient Athens, the Roman Republic at its beginning, Venice, Geneva before joining Switzerland. When it comes to the nation, I posit that a very important distinction has to be stated. I propound that a huge difference is to be made between nation as a political form and nation as a cultural form. Using shorter phrases for convenience, I will talk of political nation and cultural nation, but keeping in mind that I'm referring to forms, the types. This distinction is important because it clarifies discussions which are often blurred without this distinction. While debating, one person refers to cultural nation, whereas another refers to political nation. They often think they are talking about the same subject, but in fact they are not. Such a confusion was obvious throughout the debate on the French national identity launched by the government 1 year ago. You can believe me on this point. I suffered a lot. So the first advantage of such a distinction is a better understanding of national, and consequently a better way to address the issues when we are dealing with nation and nationalities. Basically, this distinction stems from historical perspective and historical sequences. The cultural form of the nation is the older one. It means people sharing a language, customs, habits, traditions, lifestyles. For example, the political form of ancient Greece, I've just talked about Aristotle, as we have already said, was a city-state. No political nation made sense at the time. Meanwhile, Greece existed as a cultural nation on a larger scale, as a land of cities sharing the same culture. The existence of such a nation was embodied by the allied Greek cities when they united against the imperial Persian invaders. The united cities, against all odds, defeated the mighty empire. Even more unexpectedly, a few decades later, a young general united Greece by force and leading its army conquered the Persian Empire before ending its staggering trip in India. What you observe in this sequence is as follows: the city-state as a political form giving birth to a new empire. Not the first one, but a new empire. There was a real national stage in the middle of this sequence because of the unification of Greece by Alexander. But this was only as a cultural nation, and moreover, this nation was expected to integrate into a new world empire. So, where we will find nation as a political form, finally. This history would be long, starting from from the European Renaissance, enduring the religious civil wars, and ending in the coexistence of national monarchies, the German Empire, and the belt of city-state remaining at the core of Europe. The emergence of the political nation occurred, it's my point of view, it's my standpoint, in 1787, when the Constitution of the United States of America defined a new nation as a political form. This was not founded on the previous tradition, nor on a pre-existing people. No established power had to be destroyed, no monarch to be debunked. The idea of a political nation emerged as an experiment, an endeavor, even as a dream. At the same moment, amid ceaseless exchanges of ideas and men, in 1789, the French Revolution created a new European nation as a political form. This transatlantic moment has been justly called the decade of sister republics. In both cases, the principle of the nation, strongly and mainly political, defined a new body politic made of equal citizens, basic human rights, guaranteed by a constitution and a state. On both sides of the Atlantic, the actors were so conscious of creating a historic landmark that they believed they were the beginners of a world revolution, acting on behalf of the Enlightenment or God or liberty or reason. Let's note that as soon as it was born and was given its name, this political nation, this nation as political form, was linked to democracy. But, it's a very important but the existence of such a link must be immediately qualified by another fact. Obviously, nation-states multiplied faster than democracies. And the political nation finally shows a stronger link with the national independence of a country than with democracy. We do not know the end of the sequence yet. Time will only tell. So I will avoid any rash conclusion on that point. It is also worth considering how unlikely is an invention of this caliber. In the human history, the invention of a novel political form is as rare as a supernova easily visible to the naked eye. Count them on the fingers of one hand. Such a possibility is nevertheless envisaged now in Europe. Can you believe this? Some people in Europe seem to gather that the European Union will create a new political form within a few decades. Others, should we call them realists, by contrast, see no other future for the European Union than a combination of the three forms, a complex organization to be built on three floors, at a city-state level, at a national level, and at an imperial level. A jigsaw puzzle very hard to complete indeed. Let's sum up. The cultural nation which is more ancient, living at a slow pace, compatible with empire or city-state as political forms, and even with tribe as a form. Weak as an institution, but resilient in fact, closer to oral law. From the standpoint of an alien, it takes a long time to integrate into a cultural nation. But once it is done, the roots reach deep. And yet, the door of a cultural nation may be shut. A cultural nation based on closed ethnic principles, narrow kinship, parental bonds and bloods, is hardly open to an alien. The political nation is a more modern form, as we have seen, and as it is political, it is largely incompatible with the other forms, the empire or the city-state, and it tends to eliminate tribes within its borders. When the nation falls short of eliminating them, the failure remains a stark weakness. See Afghanistan as an example of a state more tribal than national. A political nation lives at a higher speed than the cultural does. Hence, it may live a long life or pass away swiftly. See Yugoslavia as an example of a short-lived political nation. Note that post-colonial Indian new political nation soon was cleaved into India and Pakistan. The political nation's durability is derived from its connection to a state. The army, the taxes, the schools, the written law are maintained by the state. It is usually easier to integrate into a political nation, provided the newcomers abide by the laws. We may now take advantage of this distinction between the political and the cultural form. It enables us to consider different cases with a renewed attention. As an example of a cultural nation without a political nation. Examples are numerous, of course. Quebec. Quebec is a cultural nation which has been granted political rights inside a nation-state called Canada. It is not a political nation. This is probably the most frequent case, but a cultural nation included in a larger political nation is only one of the possible cases. You reverse the perspective, and the relation and the proportion are reversed when a political nation is included in a larger cultural nation. Let's take the example of Switzerland. Switzerland is a shining example of both relations. Small country, but very interesting. The Swiss political nation includes 4 cultural nations: a German-speaking nation, a French-speaking nation, an Italian-speaking nation, and a Romansh. Not many people know what Romansh is in China, but Romansh is people defined by a mixed Italian-German language. But if you took the same linguistic criterion from a different perspective, Switzerland is a small part of a larger German linguistic sphere extending far beyond Switzerland to Germany and Austria. And the same applies to the sphere of French language and to the Italian one. In the case of Switzerland, the political bond finally seems the stronger one. The fact may be explained by the unique regime of direct or semi-direct democracy peculiar to Switzerland. One of the oldest nation-states in Europe, the United Kingdom, includes several cultural nations: Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. The English nation is the core of the political nation, but only a part of it. As a cultural form, it is, at least in principle, on an equal footing with the other historic nations of Great Britain. Then, as a political form, it is at once less and more than the others. Therefore, the English nationalism is weaker than the Scottish, but the English political tradition tends to be equated with the British, especially by foreigners. The same may be said about the division of Latin America in two different political nations, which all belong to the sphere of Spanish language, with the exception of Brazil. On the European continent, there was an old culturally integrated nation which failed to complete a political integration: Germany. Germany possessed many features of a cultural nation, but emerged as a very retarded political nation. I cannot go into the details now and have to leave out the religious, cultural, and political causes of this retarded situation. The political retard of Germany played a tragic role in the European politics, from the 17th century perhaps, and certainly until the middle of the 20th. The construction of a modern political nation was delayed, and it was finally built on resentment and will for power, even boosted by the French Revolution, which had a positive as well as a negative appeal to Germans. Germany failed to complete a national unification as a political form, of course. The German past was hectic, conducted by conquest rather than by consent. Against France, German thinkers defined a would-be political nation on purely cultural and even ethnic grounds. So, whereas modern Switzerland was the peaceful and democratic consequence of the French Revolution, from the same standpoint, the failure of Germany to unite was the most unhappy consequence of this retarded nation building in Europe. The French Revolution had a dubious political impact on Germany, and the upshot was a strong German cultural nationalism without a political nation, but not without political nationalism. The United States began as a political federal nation, expanding to a federal frontier, western frontier. Each state keeps its local constitution. In a nation of immigrants, the nation building was nourished by very different cultures, though chiefly European. But an American way of life was a powerful instrument of integration. So the political nation is strong because of the constitution, the open frontier, and the practice of democracy, but not without political nationalism. The United States began as a political federal nation, expanding to a federal frontier, western frontier. Each state keeps its local constitution. In a nation of immigrants, the nation building was nourished by very different cultures, though chiefly European. But an American way of life was a powerful instrument of integration. So the political nation is strong because of the constitution, the open frontier, and the practice of democracy. The resulting cultural nation is at once one and diverse. Yes, it is possible. Yes, we can. And the local level and the imperial level never completely disappeared. Even the very name of this country speaks for itself. The nation borrows its definition from the continent, America. In the proper sense, it is a nation without name. As the revolutionary France during its Napoleonic outcome, the United States might be defined as an imperial nation, but they are not an empire at any rate. Paradoxically, or maybe not so after all, it is in America that you hear at the same time advocating multiculturalism and one nation, a recurrent phrase in President Obama's speeches. France created a modern political nation after the monarchy had done a great part of the job by centralizing the country, unifying the language, and laying military and administrative foundations. A strong and centralized state existed before the modern nation. It is nevertheless the concept of one political nation of equals represented in the National Assembly which was the defining moment. Patriotism was the cement preventing the Civil War. The result is, or was, a very compact nation in terms of politics and culture as well. What about Asia? Take the example of Japan. It is often cited by scholars as the reference of a very homogeneous cultural nation. Japan has almost always been seen as an independent and original cultural nation. This does not mean it was closed to foreign influence. The Japanese borrowed a religion born in India and the Chinese written language. They developed their own version of important techniques and adjusted their society to the open market and the open market to their society. Into the bargain, they experienced modern nationalism of the worst type before building a modern political nation of equals under constraint, being obliged to do it after a crashing defeat. Japan might in turn be compared to nationalist Germany, centralized France, and trading Britain. China is also a paradox that both approaches should clarify. From a political standpoint, the framework, in spite of periods of chaos, proved strong and resilient, the imperial framework. From a cultural standpoint, the empire includes many diverse cultures and languages, but this picture must be nuanced by the fact that the Han people are incomparably more numerous than any other population, and also by the fact that a common written language was the root and the tool of a glamorous civilization. In the wave of nation building, modernization, China turned the imperial form into a political nation state. For the reasons previously mentioned, the task was arduous, but not impossible. As a cultural nation, China still commands imperial diversity, especially at the peripheries of its territory. And yet, a part of its cultural sphere is, in small proportion, detached in Taiwan. The political form is especially interesting, since the one country, two system formula, since this formula has been devised and implemented, it is up to a certain point possible to argue that the Chinese equation is something like a nation state equaling or including a continental empire plus city-states. You would have guessed that one of these city-states is precisely the place where I'm talking to you now. Another advantage of the distinction between political and cultural forms of the nation is a theory of nationalism can be derived from it. Given that national and political nations are almost always overlapping but never coinciding, nationalism, hold my breath, it's the important moment of this lecture, nationalism is the will to make them coincide as much as possible. The coincidence that nationalism is aiming at is diverse indeed. It might be a coincidence in time, space, significance, consciousness, sentiment, power, and so on. Such a will to make two different forms coincide fails as often as it succeeds, and the successful endeavors take very different shapes. At all events, an enduring discrepancy between the two forms is unavoidable. The adjustment is possible, it is never perfect. When it is a movement from cultural nation towards a political nation, what you see is often a struggle for independence against an empire or a dominant nation state. Just take the examples of modern Greece, Ireland, Poland, India, among many others. In such an experience, bad types range from a slight infatuation for one's people's own virtues to the tragic cases of self-intoxication by racialism. Hitlerian Germany and Imperial Japan, by way of example. The reverse movement goes from political nation to cultural nation. Britain and France are shining examples, albeit on different paths at different paces. Here the bad types range from colonization to internal persecution of minorities and end in civil wars or negotiated fragmentation of territories. A peaceful coexistence of the different cultures which were clashing at the same time across Europe was embodied in Switzerland, as we have already said. But should the example set by Switzerland be considered as a potential recipe or as the exception which confirms the rule? This is a question. The frailty generated by the existence of different cultures within one political nation should not be underestimated. The historic problems range from the violent ones, Pakistan, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, Spain with the Basque, to the peaceful but fragmented Slovakia, Baltic state, and now you can add peaceful Belgium, which is now divided deeply between a Flemish population and a French-speaking one.
Not yet.
No, it's not separated. Not yet. Even countries like Italy and Spain seem rather more united by football matches than by anything else. Some reflections about, just to an addition to this definition of nationalism. We have to distinguish different degrees of nationalism. In the strongest degrees, in its strongest degree, nationalism calls for hierarchy among nations, often will to conquer. In a sense, it tends to be rather imperial than national. It is imperialism with a national center. In this average degree, nationalism, as I just said, is the will to maintain or reinforce the coincidence of the two forms. And in the lower degree, it is the will to withstand adversity and resist extinction. In the cultural sense, maintaining a language, for example. In the political sense, securing political independence. By the way, note that degree of cultural nationalism is often hard to measure. If I say Shakespeare is the greatest playwright of all humanity, I am obviously not nationalist as soon as I'm not British. But what's your verdict if I am British? Such a statement might be nationalist or not. It depends on the reasons and the context. The same applies to Chinese poets, German musicians, French painters, and so on. So how can we define cultural nationalism, finally? Perhaps by what is rejected in the process, not by what you like, but by what you dislike. It's an hypothesis. Not very conclusive, either. If I say that I'm not very fond of contemporary French cinema, is it self-hatred? So the ignorance of other cultures, a neglect for other mindsets might finally be a better criterion of cultural nationalism. Perhaps such an attitude is not conjuring up the absolute nationalist, the absolute cultural nationalist, but it certainly reveals a closed mind. On the same subject, I'd like to recall David Hume, who brilliantly clarified this question. After him, we must stress how difficult it is to strike the balance between egophilia, self-love, and egophobia, self-hatred. What is true for any individual is all the more true for a nation. It is hard to find a good balance between arrogance and lack of confidence, between pride and shame, between hope and despair, between recklessness and fear. In terms of collective consciousness, the balance is especially elusive, and propaganda plays a great role in complicating the issue. I finally, it's my last minute, I finally connect these questions with the political regime. Democracy means the organization of political free will, more responsibilities for citizens than in other regimes, and less violence from the state and between the parties involved. The democratic city-state no longer exists, at least by comparison with the ancient European city-state. A democratic empire, well, it is something that remains to be seen. Even at the imperial level of the European Union, where bureaucracy tends to prevail over democracy. Nation as a cultural form has long been undemocratic and sometimes politics averse. Nation as a political form is the modern form of democracy, which doesn't mean that cultural or political nations are bound to be democratic overnight and without a hitch. The nation-state is a possible instrument of democracy, no less, no more. A nation-state doesn't provide modern democracy as it was promised at the beginning of the Enlightenment. It doesn't either generate nationalism as some romantic thinkers hoped it would do. I mean, consequently, in any case. Beyond these facts, I think I should stop short of making predictions.
Thank you very much, Professor Delano.
Thank you.
Let us open the floor to questions. Any questions? Yes. Quoi?
You give lots of examples about America, Europe, Asia, and what about Africa for the nation building?
The coincidence is especially difficult in Africa, but I am not an Africanist. But as far as I know, it is a continent with a coincidence for lots of reasons, especially difficult. That's why I avoid it. But the question is the same.
Oh, understand.
Can I ask a question? You are probably familiar with the Michael Mann theory of sources of social power, in which Mann suggests that all political forms are basically different. It's like the crystals. He has a kind of crystallography. The sources of power are always the same: military, ideological, political, and social. But the political regimes are able to crystallize differently these sources. What do you think about this? And the second question is how you match your balance between cultural nationalism and political regimes, nation states, with what we call the process of globalization, since the process of globalization nowadays has a clear nation-state scale. Nation states are incorporating global processes, and are incorporating global legal agreements and regimes and things like that. How can we incorporate this scale, this global scale in the nation state, in your balance between cultural and political nationalism?
We start with three scales. There's a local scale, and there is a global scale. The question is, what will make the link? If you're absolutely local, you're nothing in front of the global system. So, nation state is the present response, but it's not at all homogeneous. There are very small nation states, and there are very big nation states. So the links exist, but they are very different. That would be my first answer. The second point is, as we have seen through the financial crisis, or through the, if we think of the ecological problems, for example, the environment, is that nobody can act alone and have results and find results with his actions to be efficient. But the link is needed, even when there is a global cooperation. In fact, politically, the decisions are implemented within nation states. So the different trades in the last year, in the 3 last years, seems to go in different directions. That would be my answer. The problem are more and more global, but the way to deal with them is, if not more and more national, it hasn't changed much. For the better or the worst, depends. Depends on the cases. Cultural nationalism within globalization is quite a different question. How can we explain that some cultures are remaining very vibrant and others are not? It's quite mysterious for me. Sometimes we find local explanations, but I do not know many works which are really consistent on this question. Why is it a real traditional, a real practice of traditional music in Europe only in Ireland? Perhaps Irish people here can give me the answer. I could not find it myself. So on the cultural point, the time is lacking to give really a substantial answer to your question, because we should differentiate what is about consciousness, what is about sentiment, what is about identity, and in each case the answers would be different, I guess.
One question regarding the European project. So you were pretty dismissive with the European bureaucracy, but if we put Europe in between the nation state and the global scale, and if we put democracy as the main component of the European identity and not Christianism, where do you situate Europe in this tension or in this capacity to reconcile? I mean, is it the cultural aspect of nations that are a threat in a way to the European project, if there is any threat, or is it more political in nature?
One of the ambivalence of the European project has been stressed by globalization, I think. That's one of the European problems. Europe was devised to be certainly not a supernation, but federation of nations raised to the side of the biggest nations. And now, if even the biggest nation can't play alone, of course, the European project seems a bit different, looks a bit different. But I'm not pessimistic about the European project, provided, it's a big provision, but providing the fact that it's not absolutely conducted in an imperial manner, but the imperial level exists. There's no problem about this. But enlightened despotism cannot be the solution. So our main question is how to have the efficiency of enlightened despotism with the control of democracy. I don't want chaos by democracy at the European level, and I don't want efficiency without democracy. That would be my position.
Other questions?
You gave various examples of integration of nationalities within the nation state. My conclusion, if I may take that conclusion, is that the political organization, the federation, is the most effective way of integrating nationalities. But you gave the examples of Switzerland, United States, Canada. Is this true? Is the federalism the most effective way of integrating different cultural nations within the nation state? Can we conclude that?
Federalism in itself is too abstract. I think it's a thing to abstract. Why go federalist? Why not? But the pleasure of being local can be great. It gives to many people the possibility to be at the head of something. So I think federalism works when there is something more substantial, a sort of cement. And what I gave an example of Switzerland is that it is a successful federalism, but based on something special that is semi-direct democracy. The American dream, the American way of life, and the position of superpower is the cement of federalism in the United States. So I think federalism is successful, but not as an abstract idea. It is a mean, in fact. It is means. It is not a goal in itself. Because as a goal in itself, it works 10 years, 50 years, and sometime something else occur, and the fragmentation can be as quick as the unification in many cases.
We have time for one more question. otherwise I can read mine. Right, you said that the cultural nation was the most ancient
Yes.
form. Do you see cultural nations as a static or more evolutive kind of? So do you think that once defined, these cultural nations and all its values can evolve with time?
Oh yes, yes, they are not.
So can you give us examples
They are
of
not identity.
static entities?
No, they are not. They are not identities. They are.
So what does it take for our cultural nation to evolve and include other values? Maybe war, revolution, or something less dramatic?
Cultural nations are slower, I said. They live at a slower pace because they are. The slowness comes from the linguistic and demographic components of culture. But those things evolved, of course. You know, some linguists said that there is two ways to see a language quickly disappear. The first way is that this language is spoken by no one more, no one anymore. And the other way is that everybody begin to speak this language. So it evolves quickly. So the examples. Yes, you seem skeptical, but when the languages is in a phase of universalization, very usually you cannot read a 200 years text in this language. That was the case in Greek and Latin, and it will be probably the case in English. I don't think it's good, bad things. It's probably a good thing for the people that are speaking this language, and when this is their native language, that's a chance for them. But it was just an example to show you that the cultures are evolving, and even evolving at both extremes of the span. But cultural identities, if you ask me the question, in fact, but that's my opinion, in fact, do not exist, not even as essence, but even as self-proclaimed things. I think that culture is a relation, identity is a relation. So it is what you say about yourself, but it's at the same time what the other says about you. If I want to know the French national identity, I'm much more interested, or at least at the same time interested in what non-French people say about France. And the identity, every kind of identity can disappear, I think. Perhaps with very small exception. Someone, during the French debate, someone asked me the question, what is the stronger part of French identity? I say what will remain, well, all other components will have disappeared. And probably in 2,000 years from now, in the future, some people would still be thinking about the French Revolution. So it is the part of a French national identity. But that's only what remains. That's exactly like the definition of the cultivated culture by Herriot. It is just what remains when everything else has been forgotten.
Okay, so I think it's time to end this session now. Thank you very much, Professor Delannoy, for this very provocative